Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Beyond the Taj, the podcast in which we discuss the richness, complexity, and diversity of the Indian Muslim experience from the distant past to the here and now. I'm your host, Safa Ahmed, and in today's episode, we're having a conversation with Zara Chowdhary, a multilingual writer of fiction and nonfiction who dabbles with translation in Hindi and Urdu. She's worked as a copywriter and held several jobs across movie sets and as part of writers' rooms in major Bollywood studios. But in 2002, to borrow words from her own website, Zara was 16 years old and living with her family in Ahmedabad, one of India's fastest-growing cities, when a gruesome train fire, the Godhra train fire, claimed the lives of 60 Hindu right-wing volunteers and upended the lives of 5 million Muslims. Instead of taking her school exams that week, Zara was put under a 3-month siege, with her family and thousands of others fearing for their lives as Hindu neighbors, friends, and members of civil society transformed overnight into bloodthirsty mobs, hunting and massacring their fellow citizens. The chief minister of the state at the time, Narendra Modi, would later be accused of fomenting the massacre, and a decade later would rise to become India's prime minister, sending the world's largest democracy hurtling towards cacophonous Hindu nationalism. Her debut memoir, The Lucky Ones, pulls the readers into her experience of the 2002 Gujarat Pogrom, what it's like to grow up Muslim in divided Ahmedabad, to watch on the news as people whose faith you share are butchered, to wait in and day out, for the mob to come for you next. The Lucky Ones was a PEN America finalist, in addition to being listed number 4 on Time Magazine's top 10 nonfiction books of the year, and recognized in lists by Electric Literature, NPR, Esquire, People Magazine, and The Atlantic, among others. And she's here today to talk in more detail about her memoir and her experience. Zara, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Safa. Thank you so much for having me.
I highly encourage all of our listeners to go out and get your hands on a copy of The Lucky Ones. It really can't be overstated what a powerful, poetic, and deeply empathetic writing voice Zara has. But for those of us who don't have The Lucky Ones already on their Kindle or at the library, Zara, would you be able to start us off by reading an excerpt from your memoir?
It would be an honor, yes. I am going to read a little section from a chapter called How to Grow Flowers in a Bedroom, and a little bit about why I've chosen this section. I think one of the little details we always tend to not see when we think about big pogroms or massacres or genocides is that even within that sort of violence, people are desperately trying to clutch onto a sense of normalcy. And in our home, that sense of normalcy often came in the hidden spaces of being in a bedroom or locking the door and just sort of escaping for a little bit into our imaginations. And so this is a little section about the love that my sister and I had for dance. And so I'm going to start off halfway through it, and it starts sort of mid dialogue. So if it gets very dramatic suddenly, I encourage you to be prepared for it. Arey, no two states of this country can stand each other. Everyone is fighting over food or language or rivers. We have 4 of them in this house, we learn to say, trying to normalize or exoticize our home's dysfunction for ourselves. It's true. Dada is from Punjab in the north. Dadi is Gujarati. Amma's mother is from the mango coast of Western India. Her dead father is from the south. We blame the diversity for the disturbance. Too many stories in collision with one another, no shared tongue. But it's also very not true. Amma said yes to this marriage, dreaming that she'd learn to dance the garba, a dance she had always marveled at from 1,000 miles away. Pupu can cook herself any cuisine in the world, but she rushes to the table first when Amma is frying dosas. Dadi hates the mention of Dada's family in Pakistan's Punjab, but she pushes my sister and me to dance in front of the guests to every Punjabi bhangra song played at weddings we attend. Tumhare khoon mein hai ye, she reminds us. It is all in our blood. No, the madness in our home, like the rest of this country, lies in our search for a strong man. In our home, no man is strong enough. Dada is haunted by how he failed. Papa withers under the burden of his own mistakes. The women become dictators when they become divorced or widowed. There is no room in C.H. Jasmine for grace. So we huddle in our parents' bedroom each night, telling each other stories, making up imaginary ones in which we live by forests and little streams, just Amma and Misbah and I. There is a tape deck in the room, a wedding present for Papa and Amma from his friends in college. It's his prized possession. Papa takes us every Friday to Law Garden, where in the evenings, a man sells pirated and original audio tapes from the back of a converted tempo traveler. Albums of new and old Bollywood films, as well as collections of ghazals, devotional Sufi and bhakti music. Papa never buys pirated. They will spoil his deck. If ever his purchases turn out to be fakes and the tape spools out and jams the player, he goes back and fights with the tapewala, calls him a dozen names, and then buys 3 more tapes. He buys Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan for himself. Some mornings he plays it after his shower and raises his hands and hums Allahu, Allahu, as if temporarily possessed, energized, tentatively tethered to a faith he doesn't understand. This is the only grace I see. I watch him, his soft beer belly rising and falling, the depression dropping away like the seams of his semi transparent cotton kurta, suspended around all of this heaviness. Since the riot started, he hasn't played it. But one Sunday, bored out of his mind, he opens the deck up and cleans the head with cotton swabs and Dada's Urbiklon. When Misbah and I shut the door of Amma's bedroom that evening, we look at each other conspiratorially. We switch on the tape deck and allow ourselves the same grace. Grace is the only language Misbah and I know to speak in. It has been our shared tongue as sisters since before we learned how to talk. We don't yet know what it means to save each other, but we know something happens when we dance. We feel redeemed. We have done this each evening from the moment we started to walk, from the moment we recognized our world burned like clockwork each evening. We insert our favorite tapes one after another, hits from 2001, Lagan, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, Dil Chahta Hai, Aks, Lajja, Nayak, Pyar Tune Kya Kiya, Zubaida. We haven't watched all the movies. Papa takes us to the theater only for the big ones. But song after song we go, moving and making the movie with our bodies. Through the moods and bhavs and rasas of each song, we make up steps and build facial expressions. We construct entire lives and love stories filled with heartbreak and mischief and sublime joy. Amma slips into the room in between dinner preparations to watch us. A few times Dadi and Pupu peep inside too. Appa sits on the bed, arms folded, her grim mouth slackening into a smile. There is nothing to dance about right now. But in C8 Jasmine, there seldom is. Dance is the only way Misbah and I know to transcend this reality. When Amma comes in to watch, I watch her back. As she leans her tired back against the linen closet, her smile building from her thick lips to her honey eyes. Soon she's clapping with our every shimmy and shake. She lets out a soft hoot. This is all she can do. Dance is teaching us what she can't, mustn't, that we have power, and as long as we have each other, our souls will be okay. She watches us bloom amid all this smoke, gracefully stretching into life, grateful we are hers, thankful we are alive.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think, doesn't that just encapsulate so much of what this book is? The story of India, both from the beginning of the country itself, all the way up to this moment where the world goes up in flames, told through the eyes of this one family. It's absolutely stunning. And The Lucky Ones was published in 2024, which is 22 years after the Gujarat Pogrom. So, Zara, I wanted to ask you to start us off, what motivated you to write this book?
I think it was this sort of strange place that I found my mind in, this intersection of the past and the present. For many years after we left Gujarat and we went on to live our lives as, Indians in southern India, there was a sense of leaving this behind, of repressing these memories, of almost looking at it as some sort of blip, some sort of historical irrationality that had taken over, this sort of momentary madness that had taken over our people, our country, our citizens, our cities. And to think of that as an anomaly, and to think that somehow we had been unfortunate to live amidst that, But now we were seeing what the real India is and what really means to be embraced and loved and belong in this full way, right? And so for the longest time, I actually never wanted to be identified as somebody that had lived through 2002. There were moments when very close friends, family friends of ours would know. And if in a group setting, if people were talking about, the 2014 elections, when those were coming up, people would point at us and say, oh, these people lived in Gujarat and you should just hear it firsthand from them. And then we would sort of shrink back from it. And I would see my sister, myself, really not wanting that target and that sort of spotlight on us because we wanted to believe in our better angels for sure. I think to some degree by 2019, when the second term of the government started, and then when the CA and RC protests really built up in India, something in the air just felt like this inevitable sort of cliff that we're all riding towards. And within that period, I had come away to the US. I had gone back to school to try and, sort of ground myself in literature and writing again. And I had been thinking through just a very personal story of my family. And I started with writing my father's story because my whole life as an adult has been trying to grasp the what happened with my father and the violence of his alcoholism, the sort of diminishment of him as a person, the way that we lost him much before we lost him to cancer. We lost him as a person to anger and the sort of volatility, right? And so, what does it mean for a family to try and remember a man like that? And every time I kept going back, I felt like there was a layer that I was not understanding and I was not accessing. And in that winter of 2019, 2020, when I sat with just these pieces I had written about my father's story, I recognized that a huge part of why my father used to come home every day and drink and then get violent was because he used to spend all day in this government job in the electricity board of the state, where on a daily basis he would be reminded of his Muslimness. And this is a man who was not Muslim by any definition, other than the fact that his name was Muslim. He didn't know how to pray. He had never been taught the Quran. He didn't fast. He drank. So, in so many ways, he was very much the kind of, textbook good Muslim that is shown in our media and culture as this sort of secular figure that has worked so hard to assimilate themselves into the mainstream, into government and the functioning of the nation. And he would come back with all of this baggage every day and offload it on his family in this way. And during that period, I was very lucky to talk to, so this is happening in India, the protests are going on. I'm working on this piece about my father. And then I happened to be able to talk to Rob Nixon, who is this public intellectual in the US, right? And he talks about slow violence. And he talks about the importance of understanding this trickle down effect of violence. That when there is state violence against the individual, how that then transforms the family as well. That piece just became transformational for me to try and realize that there is a huge kind of two-way exchange between the family and the state. And in thinking about that, I was also reading from this incredible scholar of women and gender studies, Gerda Lerner, who used to do Holocaust studies and then, started talking about how patriarchy and authoritarianism or fascism go hand in hand. And she had this incredible line that is always stuck in my head that says, patriarchy at the dinner table is fascism on the streets. Right. And so that really transformed how I started to think about the book. And I started to think about my role in telling a story. That, yes, I have physical, embodied ways of remembering 2002, but I cannot write it only from the perspective of being a victim of it. I have to tell a bigger story of what patriarchy in the household looks like, which is why that line, right? That the madness in our house was our search for a strong man, and that in our house, no man was strong enough. So that's really how the book came to be.
In your father's story, there is this tragedy, as you mentioned, of a man who was deeply impacted by the social fabric around him, and through that fabric, the violence that really permeated the lives of Indian Muslims and continues to do so in increasingly difficult and stifling ways till this day. But you grew up in the 90s, right? And that's a time that is now romanticized by those who live in Modi's India today. And it was also an era that certainly bore the scars inflicted by the 1992 Babri Masjid demolition. So how would you describe the social fabric of the Gujarat of your childhood in this, like, way that balances both of those things, the nostalgia as well as the beginnings of that trauma?
That's such a great question because that's always the big fault of reminiscence, right? That you start to romanticize the past in this way. And so much of even writing the book was to try and stay away from that trap. Because as much as I grew up in the India of, a Bollywood where the three Khans were reigning and the films were all romances. It was all about love conquers all and, Ja ji le apni zindagi, Simran. Like we came up with, and we still laugh about some of that, my peers and I, my friends and I, of how much of this nonsense was filled in our brain by the movies and what lovely, simplistic escapism it offered. Life in India has always been hard for one side of India. And there's another side of India that can always romanticize and glamorize what it means to live in India. And I think that in going back and revisiting, again, I had to see that even within the same household, we all lived in so many different Gujarats and so many different Indias. So my grandmother's Gujarat, because she has heritage and roots there, but heritage that has been earned on the edifice of caste, right? She comes from what is would be a upper caste or dominant caste Muslim family in India, that were land owning, that were barristers or magistrates in the British era. That's a very different sense of belonging to a land and a state when you come from that category. My grandfather, on the other hand, was a man who had run away from Punjab just before it was partitioned, and in fact ran away because he did not want to belong to a feudalistic society like that, who did not want land and ownership to be his definition. He just wanted to be an afsar. He wanted to be a officer in modern India and serve in its building. And he was a poet at heart. So there was that India. And as he grew older and once he retired from government service, he became the person that would look after our local Indo Islamic monuments through the Waqf board in the city. So there was that Ahmedabad and that Gujarat of a man who simply looked at legacy in terms of stories, in terms of monuments, in terms of art. There was this Gujarat of my father and my aunt where you had to know people to move ahead. And that sort of knowing, that kind of pehchan, right, which is in India means like, who do you know who can get you a job? Who do you know that can get you school admission? Who do you know that can get you into a certain circle or, get your kids into this tuition class? That sort of pehchan again comes from assimilation. It comes from fully secularizing yourself. Do not say salam out loud. Do not say inshallah, mashallah out loud. Don't wear hijab, speak in a way that completely removes any lehja in your voice. So again, that sort of code switching that was very natural to them was because they were children of the 60s and 70s, and they had learned that this is the way to succeed in modern India. And they came from that sort of space. And then there was our Gujarat, because we were these children of a mixed sort of marriage, right? Of a South Indian woman and a part Gujarati, part Punjabi person in, living in Ahmedabad. And so we constantly felt lost and we constantly grew up feeling like there was no sense of belonging. We were neither here nor there. We didn't fully speak Gujarati. We had no understanding of Tamil. We were told you are too Muslim to be Gujarati, but you're also too secular to be Muslim. So there was this constant sense of where do we fit in? And it's in that space that the place around me was also a city that was getting more and more segregated. So with each year, in our own building, we could see this happen, that those who used to be our Hindu neighbors, our Christian neighbors, our Parsi neighbors were moving away towards the more modern and more well, sort of the places that had better infrastructure in the city. And the infrastructure in old Ahmedabad, which was the old Sultanate Ahmedabad, was crumbling. We would get flooded more easily, we would have water shortage more easily, all the sort of, there was lower education, lower employment. So the rift between the city was truly growing wider and wider. And we would feel it more when we went to school because we had suddenly become the children that were coming from the ghetto. We were the kids that were, in winter, we would wear shalwars under our uniform, whereas others would wear stockings under their uniform. And so they would say, oh, those mozzies. So we were already learning these terms and being kind of stereotyped in these ways. We had become a trope to our own selves. So it was a very complex time. I think what wasn't there was yet the open permission to say the thing that people would want to say, or the open permission to be hateful towards each other. So there was also a Gujarat where literally on Diwali, my father would sit with the diary, in which people used to write like old phone numbers and stuff. In the days when we had landline, people used to write all the numbers in a diary. He used to open the diary, look at everybody who was going to celebrate Diwali and make a whole itinerary for the day and say, Acha, breakfast we'll eat in this person's house, then we'll visit 3 people, then lunch we'll eat there, then visit another 10 people and end up at dinner here. And we would all pile into this one car, 8 of us in this little Fiat, and then go house to house, greeting people for Diwali. And the same way for Eid, from 7 o'clock in the morning, my mother's table would be laid, and there would be vegetarian for all of our like Gujarati Jain vegetarian friends. There would be like meat for everybody else. So there was also this. There was also a sense of, oh, in Ramzan, all of the families, irrespective of, class, caste, whatever, we were all sending trays to each other's house. So there was a feeling of living this very mishmashed kind of enmeshed life. And at the same time, there was something in the air of this sort of change happening. Because along with Babri Masjid, what we also sometimes tend to forget is that India's economy got liberalized in the early 90s, right? By 91, 92, for the first time on our roads, we were seeing imported cars. We were seeing Coca-Cola in the grocery stores. We were seeing, Kit Kat being advertised. We had MTV on television. So we were also changing as much as we were forgetting what it means to coexist. We were also learning what capital and what it looks like to have material wealth and sort of changing how we valued material wealth over social wealth.
This book, I think you do such a beautiful job of walking us through your childhood, of showing us the scenes that you've just described here of your family, the outings that you would attend, the gatherings that you were a part of, and then at the same time interspersed with these stories are the flashbacks to you seeing the news, you hearing that people in towns, nearby are being murdered, they're being slaughtered. You talk about the story of Ehsan Jaffrey, Zakia Jaffrey. You talk about Bilkis Bano. And before I get to how you handled those stories, I first want to ask you, what is your experience with the Gujarat Pogrom?
I think my experience is one of abject disassociation. It's that sort of feeling. I write about it in the book a few times of how each time the neighborhood was attacked or a mob came towards us, it's as if I would feel like my soul has left my body and I'm looking at the scene from outside. And I think a lot of people talk about that now, as I've grown up and I've read other literature, I've seen people talk about that in places of extreme violence and war where you do that as a survival mechanism, right? You're constantly living a little bit with a sense of, okay, if the worst thing I imagine happens to me, then how do I survive it or how do I make my peace with it? And for me, there are two things that happened simultaneously. I think during the actual 3 months that we were there, it made me cling to my sense of faith very, very strongly. Because really, and I think we're seeing that even now with Palestine, right? When you see people who have no other recourse, who do not believe that law and legality are there to help them anymore, who don't think that the world is coming to their rescue anymore, they then have to learn to live with this total abandon and total submission to the concept of Allah. And so I think that was a huge part of those 3 months, and I wanted the book to really reflect that. What also happened for me right after is that I really started to question the sense of and the pitch of religiosity in India, because I think that what has happened over a period of time is that we're all constantly trying to match each other at the same volume of religiosity. And I don't think that helps either. And that has been a constant conflict for me with my life. But in the last 20 years, I think every time I look back at who that Zara was and how she lived through that period, I always remember the fact that my teacher that same year, I was in 10th, right? And I was about to give my 10th boards. And that's a sort of central nugget in the story of this girl who really just wants to give her board exams. My history teacher, Miss Preeti, had given me a copy of The Diary of Anne Frank. And it's weird. It's so strange and surreal that that was the book lying in my house through those 3 months as we were going through this nightmare of our own. And there was a strange sense constantly of deriving some weird strength from a person who didn't make it, and recognizing that there is strength even in that, in telling yourself that if this is what is coming, I will still live every day as deeply as I can, right? So you see that in the book. You see the friendships in the building that we're still continuing to invest in. You see the girls dancing in the bedroom. You see the ways in which we look at food and think about how do we share from what we have. So there are ways in which people learn to survive and actually come together in moments like this.
Absolutely. And I think that Zara, that the picture you paint for us of that Zara and the people around her, your sister, your friends, it all deeply humanizes an atrocity that often, at least for people who didn't experience it, is often spoken about as statistics. This many people killed, this many homes burned, this many limbs left behind after the mobs were finished passing through. And your book is just filled with stories of the people, focused on them as human beings who lived their lives just as fully as you and your family did. And so I want to ask, the stories of the victims are very, very difficult to read. And I imagine they were also very difficult to write about. So, which of these stories haunt you the most of these victims?
I mean, clearly there are hundreds, because of which I had to only pick the ones that haunt me the most, and on a regular basis. I think because of how much Ehsan Sahab's story and Bilkis Banu's story has been in the news for the last, 20, 22 years, or going to be 25 years this year, it was but natural. Like there was no way that I wasn't going to include them in the story, because again, there was so much of how their story has been told over and over again. Repetition creates sediment, and it makes stories very, very solid and kind of inflexible, and you start to see sort of cutout image of a person, and you start to recognize that person only as a picture in a newspaper, and you stop thinking of them as a full multidimensional human being. So even just going back and looking at both their stories from all of these different newspaper articles, but then thinking about how their own families talk about them, how did they imagine themselves, that was a huge part of the process. But for me, the story that really has sat with me for years and years is of Shabana and Suhana, who are the two sisters who have gotten lost in this big archive, right, of death. And they were just two sisters, or some say cousins, who were in a village. And then the mob was their own village. The men that they had grown up with ended up being the men that raped and, mutilated and murdered them. And I think because I am a sister, and because they were the exact same age that I was, and I survived and they didn't. And we got to be in the safety and the protection of where we were, and they were out in the open and exposed in this way. I think it has always left a big hole in my heart, that story. There's something about that age, right? Of the kind of innocence and hope which you look at the world, and the innocence and hope with which you aspire and you dream and you think a certain life is going to be available to you. And it's already heartbreaking if those aspirations and those dreams don't get met. But to be met with such brutal violence at that age. And these are not new stories, because, again, with the way that violence against women works in Asia, in South Asia, and the Indian context, we've almost become immune to these stories. But I think to see yourself in them and to write them takes a certain kind of like spiritual exercise. And for me, it became important to do that exercise. That's why I enmesh it with, okay, while this was their reality and their truths, and they were barely 200 miles away from us, what was I doing in our flat? What was my sister doing? And then what was other girl whose name was also Shabana, who was supposed to get married at the time? What was she doing? So it becomes this constellation of girlhood, of what does it mean to survive girlhood in a pogrom where sexual violence is the main tool against a community.
Absolutely. I think that's such a powerful core element of this book is the fact that there's so much overlap in the experience, right? And how easily it could be one person, not another. And so much of it is just dependent on circumstance, who you are, where you happen to be at the time, and who is there to protect you. And in writing this book, this question kept coming to me because at times it is a very difficult read. You are seeing these stories of, women like Bilkis Bano going from her just being separated from her family to her seeing her 4-year-old daughter smashed on the ground in front of her and killed. And you are also seeing these stories of the perpetrators of this pogrom who went out and committed these horrific, horrific acts of violence and then almost boasting about it afterwards, being like, yes, that was necessary. Yes, I did it. Yes, I felt nothing. And so I wanted to ask you, as the author, as someone who did the research for this book and also carried that experience of surviving it within you at all times, how do you deal with the fact that most of these stories don't culminate in justice, but in fire, and that the fact that justice still eludes many of these people today, if not most of them or all of them?
I mean, that is such a big question, Safa. Because to have, I mean, this is why the book is called The Lucky Ones, because you are contending and reckoning with the fact that you have been told by the state, you have been told by some of the biggest courts that this material justice might not come to you and that you will have to find a way to survive that. And somehow, when you sit with the pain and the loss of what people materially went through and the result of what they're still living through, even that survival still feels like a privilege, right? So, having to live through and survive injustice, even then, just the act of having survived feels like luck and good fortune compared to the actual atrocity that has taken shape on someone's body, on someone's psyche, on a whole community. And to me, at this juncture, when I think about the idea of justice, it's not a sense of fatalism or, having given up, but it's thinking about how even an Ehsan Jafri, right? I write in the book that on his bookshelf in his office, he used to have Martin Luther King Jr.'s book of speeches. And the fact that, he spoke of the long arc of the universe and the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice. And that office with those books was burned to ashes. That man had to essentially offer himself up as sacrifice, thinking that if I give myself up, maybe they will spare everybody else. And after that act of sacrifice, nobody was spared. So when you know that those are the levels at which injustice exists in these systems that we have created and we have all been participants of, then your way of looking at the universe, at looking at human existence, becomes a little bit more tended towards just a sort of spiritual morality, right? Of thinking about the way that Faiz talks about Hum Dekhenge, the way that Allah tells us in the Quran of thinking about the day of judgment and what does Qiyamah look like and who is it for and whose voice will be heard and who will testify for you. And so that way of thinking, I know this because I've been haunted again by the survivors in Gujarat who live in appalling, appalling conditions of squalor and complete disregard in terms of their housing, their water, their electricity, like basic necessities. And they still speak in these terms. So for me, I learn from them. And I think that only in listening to them can I find a way to live and continue on with any sort of not solace, but a sense of how do you put your one foot in front of the other every day.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Quran because it's something that you have touched upon a few times in this interview, is the fact that Muslimness also often gets erased when talking about the Muslim experience in India. And to hear you reference the Quran, I'm also reminded of the verse where Allah says, "La tahsabanna alladhina qutilu fi sabilillahi amwata." Don't think that those who have been killed in God's path are dead. They're with their Lord alive, being cared for. And I feel that through this book, you are also playing the role of keeping their stories alive in this life, which is the massive undertaking, certainly an emotional undertaking. And we're grateful to see these stories in front of us so we can also continue to keep them alive as they are being kept alive with their creator. And to shift a little bit, actually, you recount the terrifying moment when the mobs reach your neighborhood. But you also, there's this moment that's very powerful to me where you talk about these Muslims living, it's just, I think you mentioned near your building, but it's the Muslims who are, the servants, the slums, the laborers, those who have dealt with these injustices every single day, compounding one upon the other. And these are the Muslims who are saying, Allahu Akbar, come at us, try us. They are ready to fight back. So I wanted to ask you, can you tell your audience about that moment?
I mean, the thing that comes back and remains with me every time I go back to that balcony and standing there and seeing the sort of dark shape of this mob on the riverbed heading towards us, and then seeing from the slums underneath our building this huge sort of number of completely disenfranchised Muslims rushing towards that mob, like you said, saying, that Narai Takbir Allah Akbar, like they're saying that this is who we are and this is what we'll fight for and how we'll fight. The only thing I felt standing in that moment was cowardice, a deep sense of shame and cowardice, because that is the mountain of privilege on which so many people across India and across religions continue to sit, where they're letting those who have, according to them, nothing more to lose, that let them fight. We have too much to lose. And that calculation that we're doing in that moment is my biggest grievance with people. Because even though their language is one of Allah and religiosity, what they're actually fighting for is democracy. And what they're actually standing for is coexistence and equal existence, right? And that cowardice is something that I wish more and more of the sort of liberal, privileged Indian, and even those who have sort of drunk this Kool-Aid could think about. That when you think about what is great about India and what is so wonderful about us, over the centuries, it has been the ability of our most oppressed to stand up and fight the bully, to stand up and assert their humanity, their right to dignity, and their ability to survive, right? The rest of us are just coasting on that courage that they have constantly shown. So, much as, like in India, we love to say Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, like we talk about the soldier and the farmer in these ways, we forget that those who always offer up themselves are the ones who have been oppressed the most within communities and then within the idea of the state itself. So for me, that moment, and it's always remained that moment for me of recognizing that this was the community that every single day entered our building to serve it in so many different ways, right? Somebody was a janitor, somebody was the domestic worker, the maid, someone was a lift man, somebody was the watchman downstairs, and they were all part of our lives on a daily basis. They gave so much to care for us, look after us. And it went beyond the transaction of, oh, look here, we're paying you a salary. They were our bhai and appa, and, they were looking after us on a daily basis. Coming back from school, my mother knew where I am in the building because the lift man was constantly her confidant, telling her, Zara is now on the fourth floor. She went into that one's house. Now they're all playing in this balcony. And so these relationships, how easily and effortlessly they chose to fight for everybody. in that moment, they didn't say that, oh, we're going to fight only for our slum and they can take you guys in the building, right? And that selectiveness that comes to us so easily, that moral cowardice, what I've really sat with for very long.
So to touch upon this beautiful concept, it is a spark of light in this very deep darkness that we're witnessing right now. The idea that people are still willing to stand up and fight. And we see this with the CAA NRC protests, right? You saw the women of Shaheen Bagh, the grandmothers, the women with children, the students coming out to protest for the idea of a unified and secular and free India. Recently, we've seen people coming out and taking to the streets for the right to say, I love Muhammad, despite the fact that they're being brutalized, despite the fact that they're being threatened with the demolition of their homes. They continue to hold on to this idea that, hey, I deserve to be loudly and proudly a Muslim and proudly a Muslim while being a proud Indian. And so I wanted to ask you, what is our responsibility as the witnesses, as the privileged and the lucky ones, the onlookers in the diaspora and beyond? What is our responsibility to both the victims and survivors of Gujarat 2002 in this day?
That's a complicated thing to think about because the truth is, when you see the full force of a state that doesn't care about how you assert yourself and that is out to crush any dissent, you will ultimately, I have seen the community accept that sort of second class citizenry, at least in Gujarat. And I've seen it even amongst my own friends, this sense that those who have to continue to live within those contexts and those environments tell themselves that we're just going to have to negotiate with this reality, and there's only this much we can fight. And how do we keep ourselves safe, how do we keep our children safe, how do we keep our businesses safe on a daily basis? So it's a very different reality, and I think it's very hard for anybody sitting on the outside to tell people how they should fight or what they should say or how they should assert themselves. I think what we witnessed in Delhi, we've also seen the aftermath of that. We've seen how many people have been incarcerated, how many people have not yet even, had bail hearings and trials and so on. So we're seeing that when you're up against the powers of a state taken over in that sense, that is available to people within the system and also outside of it. So having understood and accepted that reality and understood that this is what we're working with, I think we have to all come at it with a sense of, what is my one gift here? What is it that I can do? What is it, can I support education? Can I support free speech? Can I support storytelling? Can I support archiving? So, my very small way of thinking about this is that first, Allah gave me a gift, and then the many, many layers and layers of communal support and kindnesses of strangers, and my mother's interventions in helping me become this writer have brought me to a place where, if I don't tell this one story, then what is even the point of me having earned all of the degrees and made all of this journey in life? And I think that's a small little mini sort of reckoning that each of us can sit with inside ourselves, right? There's always this concept of the lesser jihad and the greater jihad, and that greater jihad is within yourself. And so if you can sit and really wrestle with yourself and say, well, other than the fact that I might have like wealth or money to contribute to a thing, what is a way that I can help a community find its sense of dignity, find its sense of assertion again? To me, that feels like the least and the most low stakes place for somebody at a distance to start from.
We'll conclude our conversation here, but I want to end by saying, Zara, thank you so much for your time today, not just to talk to us about your story, but the stories of the people who we hope continue to be remembered and fought for in all the ways that are available to us. Thank you for inspiring us, and thank you for continuing to speak out about this topic. More power to you always.
Thank you so much, Safa. Yeah, this was beautiful.
To our listeners, please, first and foremost, check out The Lucky Ones by Zara Chowdhary. You've been listening to Beyond the Taj, a podcast brought to you by the Indian American Muslim Council. Thank you for tuning in for this month's episode, and we'll see you next time. as we continue on our journey to go past the stereotypes and the monuments and explore the heart of who we are.